Hi, this is Paul, and I wanted to do a little video on Descartes, and I'm going to do it on Locke because I think they both fit into the Jordan Peterson conversation, especially in terms of epistemology and how we know what we know. And I know for a lot of people, we just are ourselves and we just experience things and off we go. But there's this entire history behind what we believe and why we believe it. In fact, there's so much history back there that that impacts us deeply, and we don't appreciate it. So I'm going to use some of Philip Carey's Philosophy and Religion in the West to run through a little bit of Descartes and talk about how it fits into this conversation.
Descartes, Locke, and the crisis of modernity. Modernity, I'm suggesting in this title, is a period born in crisis. And for the purposes of philosophy of religion, the crisis that we're interested in is a crisis of authority, especially of religious authority. A crisis that arises in the wake of the Protestant Reformation and the wars of religion and the religious division of Europe in the 16th and 17th century.
Now, I have touched on this with a number of my other videos and talked about how medieval Christianity roars in, comes into the Protestant Reformation, and there's this crisis of authority, and it's about, basically you have this divide between the Protestants, in a sense, locate their authority in Scripture, and this continues to have its manifestation throughout the history of Western Christianity, especially the Protestant Church, whereas the Roman Catholic Church, in a way, locates their authority in the Church itself. And that obviously had a long history with the relationship between the East and the West in terms of locating the authority of the Church in the person of the Pope and in the office of the Roman papacy, versus the East that had their various other church, the other patriarchs, and that conflict then gets split into this huge conflict after the Protestant Reformation, and Europe starts looking for new where can we find an authority that will give us a united authority? How can we all be on the same page again? For better or for worse, Roman Christianity in the West gave everyone the same page, the same playing field, a unified culture, a unified context, a unified ability to have a conversation, and the wars that rip up Europe just destroy that consensus. And so then philosophy, in a sense, comes in and tries to work this rationalism, which is in a sense in the cloud. You might think of the developments of Platonism, and empiricism, which is building on the stuff we can see.
17th century. Now, this crisis of authority, interestingly enough, is fundamentally, for philosophy, not a political crisis, but a crisis about texts, a crisis about the authoritative texts of the Western tradition. In fact, the word authority in Western philosophy originally referred to the authority of a teacher. Auctoritas was the Latin, and the notion was that you were an authority on a subject that you taught. A grammarian was an authority on grammar, a theologian should be an authority on religion, and so forth. We still use the word in that term, in that sense. But in the Middle Ages, a second use developed where certain texts were described as authorities. They were authoritative texts. We still use the word in this sort of sense also when we talk about consulting the authorities. Sometimes that means reading a text. For instance, if you wanted to know about physics, you would consult the authority on physics, who it turns out was Aristotle, whose treatise on physics was the authority on physics for centuries in the Middle Ages.
Now that's an important point that Carey has, and I want to, in a sense, Carey is starting in this conversation after the Protestant Reformation, after the wars in Europe, and then Europe looking for authority, and it's a crisis of authority about texts. But I think we have to back the truck up in the Jordan Peterson conversation, because he's looking at very, very old conversations, and we have to ask questions about authority earlier, and this is where we met John Walton, and the comments he made in terms of authority and texts were important because Walton gets before the authority of text. If you look at, say, where we get items from the ancient world like the Code of Hammurabi, well, this wasn't in a book. This was on a stele. This was carved in stone. The Ten Commandments, for example, in the story in Exodus, come down from the mountain carved in stone. And so before there are texts, and again, this gets into the Peterson conversation, before there are texts, well, what are they? Well, there are, in fact, authority figures. And let's let John Walton talk about some of this.
And all of the discussions about kind of how we got the Bible, lots of times we fail to bring an ancient Near Eastern perspective into that question. We think about the ancient world as if it were somehow the same as our world, with books and authors, copyright and plagiarism and authors' rights and royalties and who knows what. But when you really think about it, that's really not how the ancient world worked at all. There were really no such things as authors in the ancient world the way that we know them. There aren't anything like books in the ancient world. And yet so often we start the conversation by talking about which authors wrote which books. And we really don't have that kind of scenario. In the ancient world, we're more likely to have authority figures because the ancient world is a hearing-dominant world.
Now, again, when I get back into my YouTube conversation, is YouTube has television started and YouTube continuing to turn this world into a hearing-dominated world and an image-dominated world rather than a text-dominated world? That's a really interesting question with some real ramifications.
Not a text-dominant world. Sometimes we might call ourselves people of the book. We wouldn't be the first ones to do that, but the fact is the book part is a later development. In a hearing-dominant culture, people receive their information orally. Beyond the question of literacy, they didn't have a great need to be literate in the ancient world because that's not how information was spread or understood. It's a hearing-dominant society. You know, today you can afford to be illiterate about computer programming language because fortunately we don't need to know computer programming language to use a computer. That's not really a matter of literacy, it's just a matter of what we need to have and what we don't need to have. And we're very glad that there are people that are good at that, and we don't have to be. And so in the ancient world, we have authority figures whose information was dispensed orally and spread about orally. And there were very rare circumstances when texts would be written. And those texts would be written by scribes, not by authors. And scribes were specialists who wrote text for particular reasons. And so when we talk about a book of the Bible, we're already using anachronistic language because a book would have been the last step in the process, not the first step in the process.
Now, we got a little bit into the Pentateuch in the biblical series of the books of Moses, and Peterson talks about that briefly. And these comments by John Walton are incredibly important to this question of Mosaic authorship for the books, because Mosaic authorship, well, it depends how you understand authorship. It's nearly inconceivable in the ancient world to imagine Moses writing those books. I would say nearly inconceivable because we can't rule it out. But scribes would have written the books. I heard a story of G.K. Chesterton. Was it Chesterton, I think, who sat there and he had, different people reading to him, and he'd have them start and stop. And then I think it was Augustine that had was it Augustine? I forget who, or was it Origen? It was Origen, a number of scribes. He had all these scribes working for him. And so he's just talking and the scribes are writing it down. And so, in the ancient world, this is how books were generated. This is how writing was generated. But how this gets into the conversation with Descartes is that where does authority come from? And this is, as Philip Carey says, we have in the modern world a crisis of authority. And now, when we get into the end of the medieval period and the Protestant Reformation and the beginning of the modern period, you have the crisis of authority in texts. Now we get into the postmodern conversation. The postmodernists, in other words, say, well, you cannot, that their meaning in text can't hold meaning. In fact, text can't hold meaning. No representations can hold meaning because there's an infinite number of meanings possible. Well, and I think Peterson deals with that. I think Peterson deals with that quite well. But, so what does it mean, and why did texts lose their authority? So back to Carey.
In the Middle Ages. So the crisis of authority we're concerned with is primarily a crisis about the value and the meaning of the authoritative texts of the Western tradition, the great classics that no longer seem to give the answers to the meaning of life that they had given. For the Middle Ages, if you wanted to know the answers to fundamental questions about God, the world, the self, you would turn to texts, above all to the Bible, but also to Aristotle, also to Plato. And that turning to texts no longer seems convincing in the modern world. And that's the root of the crisis of authority. Or rather, that's the shape of the crisis of authority. The root has maybe three roots, let's say. Three roots of this crisis of authority: a religious root, a scientific root, and a social root. Start with the religious root. We've already really mentioned it. After the Protestant Reformation, Christian Europe was divided and could no longer agree on the meaning of their religious authorities, especially the meaning of the Bible. Catholics interpreted the Bible differently than Luther did, and if you were a German in that period, the question was, well, do I interpret the Bible the way Luther and the Lutherans do, or do I interpret it the way the Pope and the Roman Catholics do? So the authority no longer gave an unambiguous answer to your questions, right? So the authoritative texts were suddenly looked ambiguous and indeed incoherent, because Roman Catholics would quote certain church fathers, especially Augustine, in favor of their view. Lutherans would quote other church fathers, and also Augustine. In fact, it turns out that Augustine was the key bone of contention. Just like the scriptures, everybody wanted Augustine on their side. So what ended up happening was what Nicholas Wolterstorff calls the perceived incoherence of the textual tradition. The tradition of Western culture based on texts which had nourished this whole civilization for hundreds of years now no longer seems adequate, especially because of these religious divisions. But other things also affect this crisis of authority. There's a scientific change, the change to what we now call modern science. The view of modern science that most of us have today is that we don't look up scientific knowledge in a textbook, right? Science is not done by consulting authorities. In fact, most of us probably do consult authorities when we want to know about science, but presumably the scientists don't do that. The scientists are supposed to go and do experiments, observations. They're supposed to go into a laboratory. This is not how science was done in the Middle Ages. If you were studying physics in the Middle Ages, you would be studying Aristotle's book on physics. But in modern science, especially with Newton in the 17th century, experimental physics, the empirical sciences where you take a look at nature and observe and build your science on that, becomes prominent, and texts no longer become the fundamental authority in science.
Now that's an important point that he makes there, and one that probably most of us don't think about, because again, our view of science is dominated by the time and the place that we live. And this transition from the medieval period of science found in texts to what now is just simply axiomatic for our world, that a scientist goes out and he doesn't consult a text. The text is checked by the engagement with most often the physical world, and then the social sciences, boy, that's another, that's a whole nother angle that you've got to work through. But the engagement with the physical world, and so this, so texts are losing their power as authorities. And this is going to come in, obviously, when we get to Locke and the Christian era, that this is going to have profound ramifications, especially in communities where, in the modernist, now fast forward a few hundred years, in the modernist fundamentalist fight in the 19th century, where fundamentalists essentially say that this text is the basis for our authority on every level. So Christian, so creation scientists are going to use this text as the basis of their authority, again, because it comes from God. And you can see missiologically why this plays out in the culture as it did. But these roots go all the way back to Descartes. And with Descartes, this is going to take an interesting turn.
A third root of this crisis of authority is social. With the development of capitalism and industrialism, the notion of an inherited nobility, the hierarchy of the social order, is undermined. Social mobility becomes prominent, and individual achievement becomes the basis of greatness rather than blood and inheritance. And so the hierarchical universe of the Middle Ages no longer looks so convincing. It no longer reflects the hierarchy of the social world. We're now in a world in the modern era, especially beginning about the 18th century, when individualism makes much more sense, right? Lords and ladies become quaint, dressed up and cute and all that, but they no longer run the show. Increasingly, as we go from the 18th to the 19th century, by the time you get to the end of the 19th century, the British monarchy is there for show. It no longer has power. It's the individuals and their achievement, and they're getting elected and so forth. They're getting rich by individual enterprise. That's what really matters.
And this, again, is continuing in our frame. You look at an aspect of Jordan Peterson is his individualism, and how does that play in this? And I know we're going to get there, we're going to get to C.S. Lewis's Miracles, but part of what C.S. Lewis deals with is in many ways similar to Peterson, in that we're going to have to talk about hierarchies, and we're going to have to talk about individuals, and we're going to have to talk about how our experiences shape our foundational assumptions and our presuppositions of what is the nature of authority. One of the things that is simply true about human beings is that over time, we tend to take on and we mirror the beliefs of the crowd around us. You see this in teenagers. Hopefully in life, the older you get a little bit more differentiated, and sometimes you have more foundation for your differentiation. But this is a natural part of the process here.
So individualism takes center stage both in modern life and, it turns out, in modern philosophy. We can see this already in the great 17th century philosopher René Descartes, who's often pointed at as the first modern philosopher. He is what we could call an epistemological individualist. That is, he's an individualist in the realm of knowledge.
Now this is... If you want to get a sense of influence, you're really hard-pressed to find someone in your world who is not an epistemological individualist. I mean, think about that. Now, some of your exceptions are going to be religious people. And now I know I talked about Prager and his religious qualm, his religious comment, but this is the part of the conversation that we're in right now.
You can see that from his most famous statement. We've all heard of it. I think, therefore I am. Now, this is famous and also widely parodied. Why in the world would someone say this? Right? What's the point of saying I think, therefore I am? Isn't it fairly obvious that I exist? Why do we bother to say this? Why does Descartes bother to say this? Well, that ties us into epistemological individualism. Let's look at Descartes' project. His project is rooted in this crisis of authority that I've been discussing, for he needs to find a new basis for the certainty of science. He accepted one thing from the Aristotelian tradition, which is that scientific knowledge is supposed to be certain, unshakable. You're never supposed to have to go back and rethink it. Well, he discovered, as he looked back on his own education, that there was an awful lot of what he learned that he had to rethink. An awful lot of what he was taught from all those authorities, from all those books in his education, turned out to be not as certain as he could wish it to be. So he found that he wanted a new source of authority and certainty. And that new source was going to be himself.
Now right here we see this turn towards the subject that he will talk about. We're, in a sense, seeing the beginnings of what we find in the world now in terms of I cannot trust an authority from a book. I cannot trust an authority. I will be my own authority. Now Descartes doesn't do this, as we'll see now. He's just getting the ball rolling. But this individualism, this epistemological individualism, is really getting going in Descartes, and we're going to find it full flourishing in a number of the issues that David Brooks talks about in his book, The Road to Character.
That's the crucial turn to the self, or turn to the subject, it'll later be called. The subject means the subject of knowledge as opposed to the object of knowledge. If you take a sentence, I know that, right? I is the subject of the sentence, that is the object. So we talk about the object of knowledge and the subject of knowledge. The subject of knowledge is the I, as in, I think, therefore I am. Descartes turns to the subject in order to find a basis for certainty, because this whole textual tradition no longer seems to be the basis of certainty. Even the Bible, although Descartes doesn't mention the Bible, but certainly the texts of the sciences, the Aristotelian sciences, no longer looked like they could be the basis of certainty for Descartes. And Descartes is one of the founders of modern science. He's developed some new things in physics and especially in mathematics.
Now I think we're also beginning to see here this the beginnings in the modern era of a progressivism, because you would say, well, we prioritize and we have a bias towards newer information rather than older, and you can find this in what will implicitly be developed as what Charles Taylor will call a subtraction story. That, we have this old stuff that's in old Aristotle, but now we're getting at the root of it, because we're looking at the stuff of the world. We're doing this basic science, and so now we can have certainty. But for Descartes, if you read Descartes, and I haven't read Descartes since college, but I remember some of it, and you have all of these questions. You have the great debates between the empiricists and the rationalists. Where can we find certainty? And where the Platonists have the advantage is that they can say, well, I can find certainty of love that does not decay in the form or the idea of love, but every instance of love that I find out in the world decays and is wobbly and is smudged and dirtied by human contact, and that's where you get this Platonic dualism. And then you've got Aristotle's idea of, well, the form of the horse is in that horse, and so it's from that point that I'll get the horse, and this is where you get this whole history of philosophy. But now with Descartes, we're turning inward and we're looking for certainty, and now you're going to be a little surprised at where Descartes will actually be able to piece this all together.
So with his newfound knowledge of physics and mathematics, the old physics and mathematics, which he was taught in school from authoritative texts, no longer looks convincing. He needs a new source of certainty. And as a mathematician, of course, it makes sense to think of certainty as coming from your own mind, right? You don't need to learn it from books. So Descartes needs certainty. How's he going to get it? He's going to turn to himself, to his own mind. He's going to have to figure things out for himself, see it for himself as an individual. That's epistemological individualism. So Descartes wants certainty. How's he going to get it? Well, he proposes what's called now a method of universal doubt. If you want certainty, start by doubting everything that you're not sure is certain. Right? If you don't know what's certain, what's uncertain, start by doubting everything, says Descartes. You doubt whether the world exists, whether your own body exists, whether there's an external world. Now, can you doubt whether there's an internal world? Can you doubt whether you exist? Well, that's where Descartes comes up with, I think, therefore I am. If I'm doubting everything, can I doubt the fact that I'm here doubting? Right? The very fact that I'm doubting everything shows that I exist, because I can't doubt unless I exist. So, there we start with something certain. I think, therefore I am is so important for Descartes because it's the foundation of certainty.
Now, there's two things to note here. One is obviously that the turn towards the subject, and I can't doubt my own existence because something has to be doubting it. But the other one, which perhaps we don't notice, but which has also become a habit within our philosophical tradition, is the use of doubt as a tool for finding certainty. And so when we get into Christian conversations about doubt, this often comes into play because, in a sense, we have this one word doubt that we're attaching to a bunch of different experiences and meanings. And so now when we get into Locke, who's the next one that Carrie is going to deal with, now it's suddenly, we have to doubt things. This is, now ought comes into the picture. This is what we ought to do. Someone comes to me and says, Pastor, I had a dream last night that you were going to grow rings and fly away. And I thought, well, okay, what does that mean? I'm going to test this initially with doubt, and I am going to hold back and take a step back and not really believe anything. Now, part of what I wonder is that how much of this has permeated our assumptions about God. And then when you get to Charles Taylor's long story of secularization, where I seem to be able to live quite well without the old guy. I kind of like having my Sunday mornings free. Doubt is a pretty good thing. And then Tim Keller comes into the conversation and says, well, but what about those doubts? Aren't actually those doubts other beliefs that are masquerading themselves as doubt? And this business about doubting, something Descartes uses to kind of, let's get rid of all the cruft and let's find a foundation, and upon this foundation we can build our structure. And okay, but will even that entire project work finally?
This is something I can't doubt. This is something I can be certain about, my own existence. So here we have, again, epistemological individualism. Descartes is starting with his own individual being. That's what's certain for him. That's more certain than all these authorities, right? Than all these texts of the Western tradition. This is a turn to the individual self, which becomes a keynote of later modern philosophy. But notice also, it's deeply lonely. Instead of situating himself in a rich world of texts and tradition, Descartes is starting out all by himself. And at this stage, so far, he's not sure whether the external world exists, right?
And this loneliness of it's so funny how we, our Jungian great cloud of witnesses, sees these things playing out, and our heart attaches to things in them. So we see this, in a sense, now we're going to get into the hero narrative. We see, in a sense, Descartes is the noetic hero who is trying to figure out what is real and what is true. And so he begins with this noble doubting, and he's all by himself. And what's interesting is I see that played out so often with people. Well, I can't be with those people because I need to go out. So I need to go out on my own. So you have the individualism, and you have using doubt as a tool, and all of these things become habits. And now to throw in some Jordan Peterson mythological development mechanisms, all of these mechanisms then get employed to produce this contemporary hero who is, he's almost one of Socrates' cynics, and he takes on the mantle of skepticism, and we get into this pervasive skepticism in the modern era, which makes the lack of skepticism about some things in postmodernity seem just completely inconsistent.
right? He's doubted whether there's things that you can touch and sense and feel, right? That might be deceptive, right? Maybe there's some evil demon deceiving him, he suggests. Maybe there's an evil scientist who's making you have these sensations. Would be a modern version of this doubt. But what he's certain of is that he exists. So he's got his own individual being as a little tiny island of certainty. But all the rest of the world is uncertain. Does the external world exist? Well, Descartes' not sure yet, but he knows that he exists. Now, if he never got beyond this point, he'd be in a position of what's called solipsism. That's Latin for just me, just the self. Right? Solips, from sola ipsa, just the self, only the self, as if only I existed in the world. Descartes has to reckon with this as a real possibility. Maybe really I'm all alone in the world. I know I exist, but that's the only thing I know. Now, that doesn't last very long. It's a moment of horror, really, that Descartes overcomes very quickly. But it's there, and it haunts modernity. So, how do you get out of this private inner world? Well, for Descartes, you start by proving the existence of God. He has a proof for the existence of God in which what he suggests is, I have this idea in my mind of an infinite thing. How do I get an infinite idea? I'm a finite thing. I can't get an infinite idea unless there is a source of this infinite idea outside myself, and that source is God. That's a version of the ontological proof. It hasn't convinced anybody. No one is really convinced by Descartes' argument there. But the interesting thing is how God figures into Descartes' project. You start by proving your own existence, then you prove God's existence, then you say, okay, well, God wouldn't be deceiving me, there wouldn't be this evil demon convincing me that there's an external world if there really wasn't an external world. So there is an external world. We can prove that because we can prove that God exists and he wouldn't deceive us. So you start with yourself, then you prove God, then you use God as a step in an argument to prove the rest of the stuff that you need to be certain about. So God becomes part of a project of establishing individual certainty. God becomes sort of my tool for finding certainty in the world. At least that's one way of reading Descartes' project. There's a lot of reason for religious people to be kind of suspicious of this epistemological individualism. Why should we start with ourselves?
Well, and the note here that Carey makes, that talk about a window into another world, where you almost see Descartes right at the boundary of the ancient and medieval worlds, where, you know, apart from the ancient Greeks, I mean, you don't doubt God. I mean, that's the most obvious thing in the world. To the contemporary position where, well, I can know myself, but a God, well, I can't know a God. And again, if you want to get a range of the capacity for belief that human beings have, and if you want to get a view of how we are shaped by our cultures and how in some ways we are prisoners of our cultures and our beliefs, you know, this is again why I think studying history philosophy, studying history of religion, all of this stuff is tremendously helpful to gain a little bit of humility and perspective on where we are, we tiny little human beings. And again, some of you ask me about my Calvinism, and part of why I continue to embrace my Calvinism is because all of this study shows me just how small I am and how insignificant I am. And then I realized just how fragile I am. And so I could, in a sense, embrace full-blown atheism and say, well, then, when I die, I'm gone and I am insignificant. But there's some slipperiness to that slope. And it's something to keep in mind.
Well, in modernity, that seems to be the way to go because of this crisis of authority. Let's look at another epistemological.
Okay, so I'm going to pause the video here, and I'm going to start the next one on Locke.